Nestled in one of London's most prestigious neighborhoods, Elton John's Georgian-style mansion stood as a symbol of timeless elegance and celebrity allure. Yet, behind its immaculate facade and opulent interiors, the house harbored secrets that even the Rocket Man himself couldn't explain. It started with a whisper. Karen and James Millard, an American couple and close friends of Elton, were invited to stay at the house while visiting the UK. Thrilled to experience the life of a rock legend, they arrived to find a staff of polite housekeepers, a sparkling wine selection, and the warm welcome of Elton's handwritten note. But the charm of the place dimmed by their first night. Around 2 a.m., Karen was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway outside their bedroom. Thinking it was James returning from the kitchen, she called out. No response. She waited, listening as the footsteps grew louder, then stopped. When she opened the door, the hallway was empty. I swear I heard someone, Karen whispered as James stirred awake. The next morning, they mentioned the incident to the housekeeper, who hesitated before offering a half-smile. This house has its quirks, she said, briskly changing the subject. The couple brushed it off until the next evening. As they were preparing for bed, Karen noticed the bathroom door swing open on its own. She stared, heart pounding, as a chilling draft swept past her. James dismissed it as an old house settling. But when the same door slammed shut an hour later without a breeze in sight, both felt unease creeping in. The real horror unfolded on the third night. Karen and James were sitting in the living room, a grand space filled with Elton's art collection and a gleaming piano. Karen's phone, resting on the coffee table, began playing music and Elton John's song, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. I didn't touch it, Karen said, frozen. James reached for the phone to stop the music, but as he did, the chandelier above them flickered violently, casting distorted shadows on the walls. Then they heard its soft humming, coming from the piano. The keys were untouched, yet the haunting melody of the same song filled the room, growing louder with each passing second. James rushed to the piano and slammed the lid shut. The music stopped abruptly, replaced by an unnatural silence. That's it, Karen said, her voice trembling. We're leaving. But as they gathered their belongings, a loud bang erupted from upstairs, followed by what sounded like heavy furniture being dragged across the floor. James hesitated but grabbed a flashlight and climbed the stairs, Karen reluctantly trailing behind. In the master bedroom, the antique armoire had moved several feet from the wall. Its doors were ajar, revealing nothing but empty hangers swaying slightly, as if someone had just disturbed them. Terrified, the couple fled the house and checked into a nearby hotel. The next morning, they called Elton. I should have warned you, Elton admitted over the phone. I've heard things 2 doors opening, footsteps, even that damned piano playing on its own. But I can't bring myself to leave. It's as if the house doesn't want me to. To this day, Elton John's London home remains one of his residences. Friends rarely stay for long, and the staff has learned to ignore the occasional sound of footsteps or the soft notes of an unseen pianist. As for Karen and James, they returned to the States with a story they swore was true, and one they'll never forget. Karen and James couldn't shake the eerie events of their stay. Back in the U.S., Karen found herself drawn to late-night internet searches about Elton John's house. She unearthed something that made her blood run cold, a brief mention in a forgotten blog about a previous owner, a composer named Arthur Hammond who had vanished in the late 1920s. Arthur was a rising star in London's music scene until his abrupt disappearance during the winter of 1927. His final works were said to be hauntingly beautiful but remained incomplete, their melodies cut short as if abandoned mid-thought. Locals whispered about his obsession with perfection and his belief that music had the power to transcend the living world. Karen read on, her stomach churning. Hammond's house, Elton's house, was where he had composed his last piece. Some believed he never truly left. Driven by a mix of fear and fascination, she called James. We need to tell Elton. James sighed, skeptical. Tell him what? That his house is haunted by some long-dead composer? Come on, Karen. But Karen's voice was firm. Something's not right in that house. Don't you feel it? It's like it didn't want us there. Reluctantly, James agreed to reach out. Elton, always warm and approachable, invited them back to London to discuss their experience. When they arrived, Elton greeted them in his signature flamboyant style, but Karen couldn't ignore the tightness around his eyes. He wasn't sleeping well. That much was clear. "You're not the first to bring this up," Elton admitted as they sat in his sunlit conservatory, the cheerful space a stark contrast to the ominous memories of their stay. "Over the years, I've heard things, seen things, too. But it's just a house, isn't it?" Karen hesitated. "Have you ever looked into the history of this place?" Elton's expression shifted. "I know bits and pieces." "Why?" Karen recounted her discovery about Arthur Hammond, her words tumbling out in a rush. Elton's eyes narrowed as she described Hammond's fixation on unfinished melodies. "I've felt that," he muttered, almost to himself. "When I sit at the piano here, it's like I'm being guided. Songs come to me easier in this house, but they're not mine. It's as if someone else is composing through me." The room fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down on them. Karen leaned forward. "What if he's still here? What if he's using you to finish what he couldn't?" Before Elton could respond, a faint sound broke the stillness, the distant notes of a piano. Karen froze, her heart pounding. James whispered, "Is someone playing?" Elton shook his head, his face pale. "The staff left hours ago." The three exchanged a glance. Then, without a word, rose and followed the sound. It led them to the music room, where Elton's grand piano stood in the center like a silent sentinel. The lid was closed, the keys untouched, but the music continued soft, mournful, and impossibly beautiful. As the final note echoed into silence, Elton stepped forward. "Arthur," he called, his voice steady but tinged with fear. "If you're here, show yourself." The air seemed to shift, the room growing colder. Karen swore she saw a shadow move near the piano, but when she turned, nothing was there. Then the lid of the piano lifted slowly, creaking as if pushed by invisible hands. Karen clutched James's arm. "Elton," she whispered, "we need to leave." But Elton shook his head, his gaze fixed on the piano. "No," he said softly. "He's been waiting too long." And with that, he sat down at the bench, placed his fingers on the keys, and began to play. The melody that emerged wasn't one of Elton's hits. It was something else, something ancient, otherworldly, and heartbreakingly beautiful. Karen and James watched in horror as Elton's movements became faster, more frantic, his hands gliding over the keys with impossible precision. The room darkened, the shadows on the walls growing deeper and more pronounced, twisting into shapes that seemed to watch them. The air grew thick, heavy with a presence they couldn't explain. And then, just as the music reached its crescendo, Elton's hands froze mid-air. The final note hung in the room like a held breath, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, a voice low, gravelly, and unmistakably human spoke from the shadows. "Finally, it's done." Karen screamed. Karen's scream was swallowed by the silence that followed the voice. Elton sat frozen at the piano, his hands trembling above the keys. James grabbed Karen's arm and pulled her back, his eyes darting around the room for any sign of movement. "Elton," James whispered, his voice barely audible, "we need to leave. Now." Elton didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the piano, his face pale and drenched in sweat. Slowly, he turned to them, his expression a mixture of confusion and fear. Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice shaking. Before they could answer, the air in the room shifted again. The temperature plummeted, their breath visible in the icy chill. The shadows on the walls began to ripple and twist, taking on shapes that didn't belong, elongated limbs, faces with hollow eyes, and gaping mouths that seemed to whisper silently. Karen clutched James's arm tighter. "We have to go," she hissed, pulling him toward the door. But the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, the sound reverberating through the house. Elton shot to his feet, panic in his eyes. "What's happening?" The piano began to play again, this time on its own. The melody was harsh and discordant, a twisted mockery of the beautiful piece Elton had just played. The lid of the piano slammed open and shut, the keys hammering down as if an unseen force was venting its rage. Karen backed against the wall, tears streaming down her face. "What does it want?" she cried, her voice cracking. As if in response, the chandelier above them began to sway violently, casting fractured light across the room. One by one, the bulbs shattered, raining shards of glass onto the floor. James grabbed a nearby lamp and swung it at the door, but the wood didn't even splinter. The room seemed to shrink around them, the walls pressing closer, the shadows growing darker and more defined. Elton staggered toward the piano, shouting over the cacophony. "Arthur, if this is you, stop. What do you want from me?" The music stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. For a moment, it seemed as if the nightmare had ended. But then, the room was filled with a low, guttural laugh that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "I want what you took," the voice growled, each word dripping with malice. Elton stumbled backward, his hands shaking. "I didn't take anything." The voice rose, filled with anger. "You stole my voice, my legacy, my soul." Karen's knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor. James crouched beside her, shielding her with his body. "This isn't real," he muttered, as if saying it aloud could make it true. The shadows coalesced near the piano, forming the faint outline of a man. His face was indistinct, but his presence was suffocating. He extended an arm toward Elton, his voice softer now but no less menacing. "You will finish it, or you will suffer." Before anyone could react, the piano bench slid back on its own, and the keys lit up with a faint, ghostly glow. Elton stared at it, his chest rising and falling rapidly. I don't know what to play," he stammered. The shadow figure tilted its head, and the glowing keys began to press down, playing a haunting, incomplete melody. Elton's eyes widened in recognition. It's the song," he whispered. "The one I hear when I'm here." Karen, trembling, forced herself to her feet. "You can't play it, Elton. Don't give it what it wants." But the shadow's form seemed to grow darker, denser. The room filled with a crushing pressure, making it hard to breathe. James shouted, "Elton, stop." Elton looked back at them, tears in his eyes. "If I don't, none of us are getting out of here alive." And with that, he sat back down at the piano. His hands hovered over the glowing keys, and the room waited, silent and watchful, as if the house itself was holding its breath. When his fingers finally pressed down, the sound that emerged wasn't music, it was a scream. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The scream wasn't Elton's, Karen's, or James's. It was guttural, raw, and laced with agony, echoing from deep within the house. Elton jerked his hands back from the piano as if it had burned him, but the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, reverberating through the walls, shaking the floor beneath their feet. Karen covered her ears, tears streaming down her face. "What is that?" she cried. James grabbed Elton's shoulder, shaking him. "We need to leave. Forget the song. Let's get out of here." Elton, pale and trembling, nodded. But as they turned toward the door, it creaked open slowly, revealing a darkened hallway. The light from the room barely penetrated the oppressive blackness beyond. "That wasn't open before," James muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Karen hesitated, her instincts screaming to stay where they were, but the shadows in the music room were growing denser, pressing in like a living thing. "We can't stay here," she said, pulling James toward the hallway. Elton followed, glancing back at the piano one last time. The lid slammed shut with a force that rattled the windows, making him flinch. As the three of them stepped into the corridor, the door closed behind them with an ominous thud. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, the familiar layout of the house warped into something unrecognizable. The walls were lined with old photographs that hadn't been there before, black and white images of people with hollow eyes and faint smiles that seemed to follow them as they walked. "Where are we?" Karen whispered, her voice trembling. James stopped abruptly, pointing to a photo. "Wait, that's him." That's Arthur Hammond. The photograph showed a man sitting at a piano, his face partially obscured by shadow. Beneath it was an inscription, "What was lost will always be found." "Elton," Karen said, turning to him, "this isn't just about the song. He's trying to tell us something." Elton shook his head, his face pale. "I don't care what he's trying to tell us, I want out." As they moved deeper into the hallway, the air grew heavier, filled with the faint sound of a piano playing somewhere in the distance. The melody was disjointed, broken, as if someone was struggling to piece it together. Then they saw a door at the end of the corridor, slightly ajar. A faint light flickered inside, casting long, shifting shadows onto the floor. Karen stopped, her heart pounding. "We shouldn't go in there." James glanced back, his expression grim. "Do we have a choice?" Elton hesitated, then stepped forward, his hand trembling as he pushed the door open. Inside was a small, dimly lit room that none of them recognized. A single chair sat in the center, and on it rested a stack of yellowed sheet music. The pages fluttered slightly, though there was no breeze. Karen stepped closer, her eyes narrowing as she read the title scrawled across the top page. "Requiem for the Forgotten." "Elton," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is his. This is Hammond's." Elton reached for the sheets, but as his fingers brushed the paper, the door slammed shut behind them. The temperature dropped instantly, and the flickering light dimmed to near darkness. A voice filled the room, low and filled with an unmistakable malice. "Finish it, or stay with me forever." The chair slid back, as if inviting Elton to sit. He stumbled, his breathing shallow, as the piano music grew louder, echoing in his ears. Karen grabbed his arm. "Don't do it, Elton. This is what he wants to trap you here." But the shadows in the room began to coalesce, forming the shape of a man. His face was featureless, his presence overwhelming. He pointed to the chair, his command unspoken but undeniable. Elton's hands shook as he picked up the sheet music. His eyes scanned the notes, and a look of horror crossed his face. "It's unfinished. It's impossible to play." The shadow stepped closer, its form towering over them now. The walls began to close in, the room shrinking with every passing second. Karen screamed, "We need to destroy it." She grabbed the sheets, but they wouldn't tear. The paper felt like steel in her hands, unyielding. The shadow loomed over Elton, its voice a deafening roar. "Finish it." And then, without thinking, Elton sat down in the chair, the sheet music trembling in his hands. His eyes locked with Karen's, filled with despair. "I don't think I have a choice," he said, his voice barely audible over the growing cacophony. Karen and James stood frozen as Elton placed the music on his lap and raised his hands as if to play an invisible piano. The room seemed to hold its breath, the silence so complete it felt alive. And then, with the first phantom note, the shadows began to move. As Elton's hands moved through the air, the sound of a piano filled the room not from him, but from everywhere. The notes were beautiful yet fractured, dripping with anguish. With each phantom keystroke, the shadows around them pulsed and twisted, as if feeding on the music. Karen clutched James, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "This is wrong. We have to stop him." James stepped forward, grabbing Elton's shoulder. "Elton, stop playing. Don't give it what it wants." But Elton didn't respond. His body moved as if under someone else's control, his hands playing faster, the melody becoming more complex. The sheet music in his lap began to glow faintly, the notes rearranging themselves in real time, completing bars and adding new ones. The shadow in the corner grew denser, more defined. The faint outline of a man with hollow eyes and a cruel smirk emerged. "Arthur Hammond." His voice boomed, rattling the walls. "Yes, complete it. Give me what was stolen." Karen screamed, "You're killing him." Arthur turned to her, his empty gaze piercing. "He is nothing but a vessel. My work is eternal. It must be heard." As the final notes neared, Elton's face twisted with pain. Sweat poured down his temples, and his breathing became labored. Karen lunged forward, trying to grab the sheet music, but an invisible force slammed her backward into the wall. "Don't interfere," Arthur hissed, his voice now whispering inside their heads. The music reached its crescendo, a hauntingly beautiful refrain that seemed to pull at the very fabric of the room. Elton let out a strangled cry as his hands fell to his sides, the final note echoing into silence. For a moment, everything was still. The shadows receded, the air warmed, and the oppressive weight lifted. Karen and James rushed to Elton, who sat slumped in the chair, his face pale and his eyes glazed. "Elton," Karen shook him. "Say something." His lips moved, but his voice was faint. "It's finished." The sheet music in his lap burst into flames, disintegrating into ash that vanished before it hit the floor. The shadow of Arthur Hammond let out a low, guttural laugh that slowly faded, his form dissolving into the darkness. Karen helped Elton to his feet, his body weak and trembling. "What just happened?" she whispered. Elton looked at her, his eyes haunted. "I think he's gone. He got what he wanted." James helped steady him. "Let's get out of here. Now." They made their way back down the endless hallway, which now seemed to shrink and twist back into its original form. By the time they reached the front door, the house was eerily quiet, the only sound their uneven breathing. Stepping outside, the three of them inhaled deeply, the fresh air a welcome relief. The stars above sparkled in a clear sky, but the house loomed behind them, its windows dark and watching. As they reached the gate, Elton paused, glancing back at the mansion. Karen turned to him, fear in her eyes. "What is it?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "Nothing. Let's go." But as they drove away, none of them noticed the faint sound of a piano drifting through the night air, playing the same haunting melody. Back inside the house, the grand piano stood silent, its lid closed. On the polished surface, faint fingerprints appeared on the keys, one by one, as if something was still there, waiting for the next player to come. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Any coincidences with real events or characters are accidental.